It is an honor to be here. Thank you very much. I started working on the problem of self-tracking and digital health information as a sociologist of data and information. And my problem, sort of the thorny problem that I study, is how do companies, industries, and what sociologists call social institutions, the rules and norms and values we have, how do they prevent successful technology adoption? And so I found the healthcare space. You know, there's just a few sociological problems there. I'm here to bring a little bit of a different perspective from what you might have heard today, to bring in the social and cultural side and to talk about this book that I wrote with an anthropologist. When I started working with Intel on a project on consumer biosensing, I would walk into rooms much like this and say, how many of you have heard of consumer biosensing? It wasn't a thing yet when we were there in the space, trying to study how people would adopt and resist these new technologies. And so then I would ask another question, which I'm going to pose to you. How many of you, I would say back then, and I would hold up a first generation Fitbit. I'm sorry, but I'm gonna call it out. I would hold up one of these early activity trackers, and I would say, how many of you have seen this device? And in a room much like this, relatively well-educated, let's just say it, relatively rich, relatively healthy compared to the US population, I would get 1 or 2 hands up in the air. Right now I get to ask the question to you. How many of you have tried some form of digital self-tracking? Activity tracker, great, almost every hand in the room. That's how far we've come in 5 years. Now keep the hands up, because this is a test. How many of us still look at, wear, or use our digital activity or other kinds of trackers? Now, this is pretty unusual because hands stayed up. And what I'm here, and we have a problem with engagement with these devices. So what I'm going to talk about today are some of the social and cultural issues, why that might be happening, and what we can learn to inform design to make these devices better and to use them for healthcare. First, a word about this picture. So this is a picture of Rachel Kalmar. She used to work for the activity tracker Misfit. She was their chief data scientist. And she would go around conferences, technology conferences, with all of these devices strapped to her. And what I like about this picture, besides the fact that it was taken by science fiction writer Cory Doctorow of the blog Boing Boing, this picture of this woman who's a data scientist reminds us that there are these tools and devices that we have that we think about in self-tracking. They look kind of futuristic and cyberpunk, but really the practices and the techniques are not new, right? So she was kind of working on the really hard problem of how do we make something that we're really used to already everyday digital experience. Oh, sorry, thanks. Here we are, last year 110 million wearable devices shipped globally. We also have a plethora of online mobile apps, as we've talked about already. And one of the problems is, while 1 in 5 Americans have used some kind of digital tracking, either from a wearable app, either from a wearable or a smartphone app, really only about 10%, much more than represented in this room, only about 10% use one regularly or open their app, and 60% are used for less than 6 months. So we use these devices for, 60% of these are used for less than 6 months. So we have a huge fall off in engagement. My question really then is why and what's going on with this kind of data? One of the first randomized control trials, there are methodological problems that we can talk about of these, but have shown that maybe there's a disconnect between digital activity tracking and behavior change. So a study found that people not wearing activity trackers lost 40% more weight than those who did, right? And we can think about, well, what's going on? What kind of thing is this study telling us? And I think we might draw a couple of lessons. One, are people able to connect the kinds of data they're tracking to their behavior change, and to behavior change is really hard. So we're in what Gartner has called the trough of disillusionment in the hype cycle of wearables. And I think this is a really exciting place to be. And I think it's a really exciting place to launch a book about wearable technologies like we did last year. We're fully in the trough of disillusionment. And that's why we came out with a book on self-tracking. One of the things that we wanted to do in this book was talk about the tools, yes, of course, that have made this conversation possible around the pervasive sensing of everyday data from thousands, millions of people. That thought is thinkable now because of the technologies that we have. Cloud computing and the miniaturization of sensors. This makes it possible to actually have these kinds of innovation conversations. And yet, the conversations we need to be having should also be informed by the practices that people have in their everyday lives that both are encouraging or discouraging healthy behaviors, and also the practices of their tracking. We also need to talk about the communities where people are making sense of this data. Who are they talking about the data with? Who's encouraging them? Who's coaching them? Who are they analyzing? Where are they getting their information from? These kinds of communities and these kinds of practices form the basis of the book that you all may have as part of this conference, which I thank you. So one of the conversations that we wanted to jumpstart is the social nature of data. And with a product packaging designer, Giorgio Davanzo, I came up with essentially an illustration for the ways in which people were talking about data. We asked ourselves as a design problem, what might data look like if it were a product, given the way everyone is talking about what data can do? And the conversations that were happening around data were, data is an off-the-shelf, exchangeable product, one size fits all. It's ready to use. It's simple, it's in a box, it's new, it's improved, and there's zero privacy concerns. We use this as a bit of a provocation to say the social thorny problems of data aren't simply solved by necessarily adding more data or more technology to that. For example, I was at another health innovation conference in the state of California, which will keep nameless, but it's named in the book. And someone stood up from an activity tracker company and said, data lead to knowledge, and knowledge leads to change. And someone raised her hand and said, excuse me, I'm a psychologist. That's the punchline. The next thing she said was, actually, if that were true, I would be out of a job, and business is booming. We've designed digital tools in this first wave of digital self-tracking. We've designed tools with fairly simple models of behavior change in mind. And what I would push this audience to consider is how might the next generations of the systems of self-tracking, the tools, yes, but the practices and the communities, absolutely. How might those look different when we think about more complicated and more nuanced models of behavior change? So I'm going to give you 3 short insights from the book. These are all from the pull quotes. And use them to motivate just short stories before we move to our fireside chat. This is a picture from a Medicare demonstration project that I studied as part of the research that went into this book and the doctoral studies that were supervised as part of this project. And this was a project where we literally saw gathering data from chronically ill, elderly patients improved their lives. Just as Claudia mentioned before me, we know data saves lives. And yet, this was a project that didn't get continued funding. Why? Data doesn't equal change. Data doesn't equal change in our healthcare systems. Data require work, data require analysis, data often force certain kinds of actions, and those actions are expensive. That work, that analysis is expensive. Our ability to gather and analyze data may soon outpace our ability to act and interpret it, act upon and interpret it. So we need to take very clear measure of how we're thinking about data as having the possibility to do these things that really we should not be expecting data alone to do and cover. We should be looking at the ways in which patient self-tracking data can become a supplement to regimes of care, not a substitute. So, and the final point about data as the new oil, we need to be clear that data collected for one purpose is not used against someone for a different purpose. And that's far from being the case at the moment. As I wrote in an essay last year when the book came out, when your smartphone's your doctor, who's going to own the data? We don't have a clear answer in the United States yet whether smartphone collected data that has clinical implications meets the same kind of privacy and health discrimination protections as the information we might share in our clinicians' offices. Second, this is a picture of Hugo Campos. We tell the story of Hugo in the book, in part because we think his story is a powerful one of what patients can do when they get access to their own data. That patients' rights to their own data, from whether it's from self-tracking or whether it's from implanted medical devices, as his case was, gives new possibilities of asking questions in completely new ways. We're going to see different kinds of ways of querying data, analyzing it, interpreting it. But let's be careful, because there are powerful forces at play that say these kinds of data may substitute for other modes of care. And if I had one message to bring you from the world of data and the sociology of data and technology to a room of people who care about healthcare, let's be really careful about the kinds of black boxes we're building. We don't want to see the kinds of social arrangements that allow for the substitution of data and data-driven analysis for real points of care. The punchline of this story was the reason Hugo Campos became a data rights advocate was because he lost his healthcare insurance. Another sad and tragic punchline of this story could be the kinds of data that are collected ordinarily from many people then become used against them when they look to get health insurance, when they look to get modes of healthcare delivered to them. And finally, this is my high school friend, Kiara. I like showing this picture. She's an economist at the World Bank. She's pretty techie. She's proudly holding up her Polar watch, which is her digital data collection item of choice, because she gets the clearest access to the rawest form of data that she can work with and she can manipulate. We need to remember that sensors on every phone open up new kinds of possibilities for analysis. And people are going to come up with crazy and wild and really interesting, strange, wrong ways of thinking about their own data. And that's not to throw science or insight out with that bathwater, but it is to say we're going to necessarily need to change the conversations that we have if we want real engagement around people's own data. Can we start thinking about data and self-tracking data as a starting point for good conversations that can happen in the clinician's office, rather than as an endpoint for actionable insights or actionable decisions in healthcare? That may be where we get to real engagement through self-tracking data. That may be the kinds of ways that we think about starting conversations, not necessarily coming up with simplified data-driven diagnoses. And on that cheery note, I'm looking forward to the conversations that we'll have, and I just want to acknowledge the funders that helped go into this work and thank all of you for picking up copies of the book.